17 years, everyone ignored this ugly homeless man until one day a black SUV picked him up. The biting wind of early November howled through the narrow streets of downtown Chicago, rattling the rusted bus stop signs and shaking the last of the autumn leaves from the gnarled branches above. A gray, endless sky loomed over the city, promising snow that had yet to arrive. People bustled along the sidewalks, bundled in thick coats and scarves, heads down, eyes fixed on their phones or the sidewalk ahead, avoiding, at all costs, the hunched figure slumped against the crumbling brick wall of an abandoned storefront. For 17 years, he had been there. No one knew his name. Some called him Ugly Joe behind his back, an unkind nickname that had spread among the regular commuters and business owners who had long stopped paying attention to him. His face was a roadmap of scars, deep grooves carving into his weathered skin, and his nose had been broken at least once, twisting slightly to the side. A thick, scruffy beard, matted with dirt and remnants of past meals, covered most of his lower face. His eyes, sharp, calculating, peeked out from beneath a battered old cap, watching everything and everyone. Some claimed he was crazy. Others thought he was just another hopeless case, one of those lost souls who had slipped through the cracks, never to climb back out. But the truth was more complicated. Joe, or whatever his real name was, never begged. He never asked for change, never muttered a word to the passing crowd. He simply sat, a constant, unchanging presence in a city that never stopped moving. The only time he stirred was when he walked to the 24-hour diner down the street, exchanging empty coffee cups he collected from the trash for a free refill. But something was different today. As the morning rush began to fade, the usual honks of impatient drivers and the murmur of city life became background noise. Joe sat on his usual spot, wrapped in a tattered army green coat, staring at the cracks in the pavement. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something unusual. A black SUV, sleek and polished, rolling to a slow stop just a few feet away. The back door opened. A man in a tailored suit stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair neatly combed, his shoes gleaming even in the dull morning light. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he approached, his sharp gaze locking onto Joe. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone was looking at him. Not through him, not around him, but directly at him. Joe shifted, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. His fingers tightened around the edges of his coat, a defensive instinct he had never been able to shake. The suited man stopped just a few feet away. 17 years, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. 17 years, and you never made a move. Joe didn't answer. He just stared. The man crouched slightly, lowering himself to eye level. We've been watching, Joe. And it's time. Joe's heart pounded. His grip on reality suddenly felt fragile, as if the world had tilted on its axis. Time for what? For years, people had passed him by, whispering cruel remarks, treating him like a ghost. But now, a stranger in a suit stood before him, saying something that made Joe's stomach churn with unease. Then, before he could react, the man pulled something from his coat pocket. A photograph. He held it up, allowing Joe to see. Joe's breath hitched. It was an old photo, faded around the edges, but unmistakable. A young man, clean-shaven, strong, with eyes filled with life. Joe knew that face, because it was his. 17 years ago. And just like that, the past Joe had buried came roaring back. Joe's fingers trembled as they hovered over the photograph. He could barely process what he was seeing, his own face, youthful and strong, staring back at him from a time that felt like a different lifetime. The man in the suit remained silent, watching him with an intensity that made Joe's pulse pound in his ears. How? Joe's voice cracked from disuse. He swallowed hard, trying again. How did you get this? The man slipped the photo back into his coat. That's not important right now, he said coolly. What matters is that you come with me. Joe's instincts screamed at him to run, to disappear back into the shadows like he had for nearly 2 decades. But something about the way this man spoke, the confidence, the certainty, made it clear that wasn't an option. This wasn't a request. Joe pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching from years of neglect. And, if I say no? The man's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. Then you'll be answering to people who are far less patient than I am. A cold dread settled in Joe's stomach. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just some curious passerby. He was someone with power, someone who had been looking for Joe for a long time. And now they had found him. The interior of the black SUV was pristine, the leather seats smoother than anything Joe had touched in years. The driver, a man built like a tank, never once looked back as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Joe stared out the window, watching the streets blur past, his mind racing with questions. The suited man finally broke the silence. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said. "I work for people who are very interested in you, Joe." Joe scoffed, rubbing his rough hands together. "I don't see why. I'm a nobody." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "That's where you're wrong." He reached into a folder on his lap and pulled out another photo, this one of a younger Joe, standing beside a group of men in military uniforms. Joe's breath hitched as he recognized them. His old unit. Daniel tapped the photo. "You were one of the best. Special Forces. A damn ghost. Then, 17 years ago, you vanished. Everyone thought you were dead." Joe clenched his fists. "Maybe I should have been." Daniel ignored the remark. "Someone from your past has been looking for you. And they're not the only ones." Joe turned away. He had spent years burying his past, hiding from it. And now, it was coming for him. The SUV pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a high-end building. Daniel stepped out first, motioning for Joe to follow. They entered through a private elevator, which led to a sleek office overlooking the city's skyline. Joe's ragged appearance stood in stark contrast to the pristine surroundings. A woman in a navy blue suit stood waiting. Her sharp green eyes studied Joe with an expression he couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe even pity. "Mr. Matthews," she said, using his real last name. It had been so long since he had heard it spoken out loud that it sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm Agent Claire Lawson. I work with an intelligence agency that's been monitoring some very dangerous people connected to you." Joe shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Claire slid a folder across the table. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough to recognize one face in particular. "Sergei Volkov." Joe's breath stalled. "That's not possible." Daniel folded his arms. "Oh, it's very possible. He's alive. And he's been looking for you." 17 years ago, Volkov had been the last man Joe had seen before his world collapsed. A ruthless Russian arms dealer, Volkov had been responsible for an ambush that had wiped out half of Joe's unit. Joe had barely escaped with his life. He had spent years believing Volkov had died in the explosion that ended their final encounter. But the photo in front of him said otherwise. Joe gritted his teeth. "Why now?" Claire leaned forward. "Because something big is coming. Volkov isn't just back, he's planning something. And we believe you're the only person who knows him well enough to stop it." Joe ran a hand through his tangled hair. He had spent years living as a ghost, trying to forget. And now his past was dragging him back into the fight. Joe knew he had a choice to make. He could walk away, disappear again, let the people who dragged him here deal with Volkov on their own. Or he could face the monster from his past head-on. But if Volkov was back, it meant innocent lives were at stake. And that was something Joe couldn't ignore. He exhaled sharply. "What do you need me to do?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Claire, who nodded. "We need you to go undercover," she said. "Volkov has a network, and we need to know what he's planning before it's too late." Joe leaned back, a bitter smirk on his lips. "So, after 17 years, I go from being ignored to being the most important guy in the room?" Claire's expression softened. "Sometimes, the world isn't done with us, even when we're done with it." Joe closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded.
"All right," he said.
"Let's finish this." And with that, the fight he had spent years running from began again. The heavy rain drummed against the sidewalk, pooling into shallow rivers that streamed down the curbs. People hurried by, clutching their coats and umbrellas, but no one paid any attention to the frail man standing near the alleyway. 17 years of being invisible had taught him that much. People only saw what they wanted to see. But tonight was different. As the rain poured, Thomas shivered beneath his tattered coat, his hands gripping the small, crumpled piece of paper he had carried for over a decade. The ink had faded, but he knew every word by heart. It was the last thing his wife had written before she disappeared. Meet me at the old library when you're ready to come home. For 17 years. He'd wondered what she meant. What had she known that he hadn't? Why had she left? And why, after all this time, was he still clinging to the hope that she was out there? A low rumble of an engine snapped him out of his thoughts. The black SUV slowed as it approached the curb, its tinted windows unreadable. Thomas stiffened. No one had ever stopped for him. Not like this. The door opened. A man in a tailored black suit stepped out, his sharp gaze sweeping over Thomas before motioning toward the car. Get in. Thomas hesitated. He had spent years avoiding people, distrust ingrained in his bones. But there was something about the man's voice, something authoritative yet strangely familiar. His gut told him this was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. With a deep breath, he climbed into the SUV. The warmth inside made his limbs ache as feeling returned. The man shut the door behind him, sealing them in a quiet cocoon of leather and hushed tension. Do you know who I am? The man asked. Thomas studied his face. There was a striking resemblance to someone he had once known, but time had stolen his ability to recall details clearly. I don't know, Thomas admitted, his voice raspy from years of silence. The man nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Thomas. The moment Thomas laid eyes on it, his heart stopped. It was a family portrait, his family, himself, his wife, and their son. But what made his breath hitch was the realization that the man sitting across from him was the very boy in the picture, now all grown up. David. Thomas whispered, his fingers trembling as he clutched the photograph. David's jaw tightened, emotion flickering across his otherwise composed face. You should have come home, David said, his voice thick with something between anger and grief. Tears burned in Thomas's eyes. I tried. I didn't know how. I thought. His words failed him. 17 years of isolation had built a wall of shame around him. He had convinced himself that his family had moved on, that they had forgotten him. But now, faced with his son, he realized the truth. He had been running from his own fears. David exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together before speaking again. Mom left that note for you, Dad. She waited. She went back to the library every day for years, hoping you'd come. Thomas clenched the paper in his hands. And now, he asked, barely able to get the words out. David's expression darkened. She's gone. The words sliced through him like a blade. His chest heaved, and for the first time in years, he let out a broken sob. I was too late, he murmured. David watched him for a long moment before speaking again, his voice softer now. She believed in you. Even when I told her you were probably dead, she refused to give up. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. Why are you here now? David hesitated before answering. Because I saw you. On the street. A few weeks ago. Thomas blinked in surprise. I didn't recognize you at first, David admitted. But when I looked into your eyes, I knew. And I couldn't ignore it. Thomas wiped his face, his heart pounding in his chest. So, what now? David leaned forward, his voice steady. That depends on you. If you want to come home, there's a place for you. But you have to be ready to face what you left behind. Thomas felt the weight of the years pressing on him. He had spent so long believing he had no way back. But here it was, an open door. He could walk away and remain invisible. Or he could step back into the world, into his son's life, and finally face the ghosts of his past. With a shaky breath, he reached out and grasped his son's hand. I want to come home. David nodded, his grip tightening for just a second before he let go and signaled the driver. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Thomas stared out the window at the rain-soaked streets, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, he didn't look away. This was his second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. The SUV moved steadily through the quiet streets, carrying Thomas toward a life he never thought he'd see again. He sat in silence, his body tense, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every streetlight that flickered past was a reminder of the time he had lost, the years spent in the shadows, unseen and forgotten. But now he was going home. David sat beside him, his hands clasped together as he stared out the window. The resemblance between them was undeniable, but there was also a distance, a chasm built over 17 years of absence. Thomas swallowed hard. "Where are we going?" David exhaled before answering. "To the house." "Your house?" Thomas's throat tightened. "My house." David turned to him then, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "Mom never sold it. She refused. Said she'd leave the porch light on for you." The weight of those words settled over Thomas like a blanket of grief and hope intertwined. His wife had waited. For years. Until the very end. He didn't deserve it. But maybe, just maybe, he could still make it right. The drive felt both too long and too short. When the SUV finally rolled to a stop in front of a small house at the end of a quiet street, Thomas's breath hitched. The porch light was on. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle. The house looked the same, worn but sturdy, like it had stood against the storms of time, waiting for him to return. As he stepped out of the car, the air smelled like damp earth and old memories. His feet felt unsteady as he approached the porch. David walked beside him, but said nothing. At the door, Thomas hesitated. He reached out, but his hand hovered just above the knob. Then the door opened. A woman stood there, her face full of surprise and something else, something guarded. "Dad?" Thomas blinked. His breath caught in his throat. "Sarah?" She nodded, stepping forward. She had been just a little girl the last time he saw her. Now she was a grown woman. He had missed her entire childhood. Tears blurred his vision as she stared at him, emotions warring across her face. "You're really here," she whispered. Thomas swallowed the guilt and the pain and did the only thing he could. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. His voice broke. Sarah's lip trembled, but before he could say anything else, she threw her arms around him. For a moment, Thomas couldn't move. Then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around her too. David stepped up behind them, clearing his throat. "Come inside," he said quietly. Thomas nodded, following them in. The house smelled like home. He had expected dust and emptiness, but instead, it smelled like warm wood and faint traces of his wife's favorite lavender candles. He swallowed hard as he took in the living room. Photos lined the walls. Pictures of Sarah and David growing up. Birthdays. Holidays. Moments he had missed. And then there was one picture sitting on the mantel. A photograph of him and his wife, taken before everything fell apart. His fingers brushed over the frame. "She never gave up on you," Sarah said softly. Thomas nodded, his heart heavy. "I know." For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. He turned back to his children. "I don't know if I can fix everything," he admitted. "But if you'll let me, I want to try." David studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Then let's start with dinner." It was a simple invitation, but Thomas felt the weight of it. A second chance. As he sat down at the old wooden table, surrounded by the family he thought he had lost forever, he realized something. 17 years of being invisible had taught him loneliness. But tonight he was finally seen. And he was never going to disappear again.